Today at the National Press Club, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Last night's budget promised to ease cost of living pressures and invest in the industries of the future. But the test remains tackling inflation, and the Treasurer is confident his government's plan will work. Jim Chalmers with today's Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you today from the Great Hall of Parliament House, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle. I'm the club's president. On indulgence, someone asked me last week how many budgets I had covered. The earliest set of annotated budget papers I can find is 1984. 40 years ago. We all get a bit excitable about federal budgets in this place and the traditions of covering it, but I just thought I would give it all some historic context today. The 1984 budget was the first to be televised. Treasurer Paul Keating's second budget contained a lot of language that would sound very familiar to anyone who was listening last night. Keating told the House of Representatives that Australia had before it an historic opportunity to embark upon a new growth path built around personal income tax and tax breaks for the mining industry. But the numbers were a bit different. GDP growth was 10% and inflation had fallen to 6.5% and was tracking to just 5%. The government was using the Prices and Incomes Accord to buy wage restraint from the ACTU in return for things like tax cuts and the introduction of Medicare. The idea of a trade-off occurred to me last night with the government's $300 energy rebate, which is designed to reduce the headline inflation rate and, as a result, produce a cut in official interest rates at year's end. But let's let Treasurer Jim Chalmers put his third budget in a preferred context. Please welcome him to the lectern.
Good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate the introduction. Thanks, Laura, for putting last night's budget into the proper historical context. I really appreciate the invitation from Morris, the support of the sponsors, and I wanted to thank Stephen and Westpac for supporting the lunch again. I'm grateful for the hospitality, thanks to the Press Club and to the Parliament staff. And I'm also grateful to all of you who've turned up and backed up after another busy budget night, to gather again on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, to acknowledge elders and customs and culture, to put our third budget in its proper context and to take your questions once again. I think this is the 10th time I've spoken at the Press Club, and I think last night was my 18th budget lock-up. And I'm about to out myself, given Laura's introduction. It was me that asked Laura how many budgets she had covered, and I know that my 18 is almost half as many as Laura has done in her time covering Commonwealth budgets. I also know my 18, about half as many as Laura Tingle, about twice as many as Laura Chalmers, who is also here today and was here with our kids last night. And I'll hope you indulge me when I say there is something about having them around in budget week that just absolutely fills my heart. And I can't thank you enough and thank them enough for everything. And also to give a shout out to Nan and John, who is at home in Logan City looking after our little Jack, and to thank them for all they do for our family as well. Now, after all of these budgets, two things are really, really clear to me. The first is that the credit for budgets is never adequately shared, which is why I'm always grateful for this opportunity to be here and to provide a shout out, particularly to my office, really quite remarkable group of people, and also to my department, the Commonwealth Treasury. And so I wanted to say to Stephen and Jenny and Glyn and all the officials and all of the staff right across the government who worked around the clock to put it together, just how much we appreciate your work. I also wanted to acknowledge and thank the Prime Minister for being here once again. I'm not sure the PM has missed a Press Club address from me as Treasurer, and Morris is nodding, which is a very generous thing for you to do, PM. I appreciate that. But much more importantly than that, I think I speak on behalf of the whole Cabinet when I thank you for the really inclusive way that you lead our team. It means a lot to us. We're very fortunate and we're very grateful for that as well. And I'm especially grateful to you, Anthony, for the opportunity to work in and with your team. with the outstanding Expenditure Review Committee represented here today that includes Richard and Penny and Catherine and Stephen and Michelle and both of the Marks in our Cabinet. And I wanted to thank you in particular, PM, for the opportunity to work so closely with my absolutely invaluable and unfailingly selfless friend in Katie Gallagher. I think I said at this time last year, and I mean it again this time, I simply could not ask for and I could not hope for a better colleague. And so much of the workload is carried by finance ministers in any government, but I think that is especially true in our government. So please put your hands together for Katie Gallagher. The second thing I've learned after all these years is that budgets get notoriously oversimplified. Our first budget in 2022 was about funding our commitments in key areas like early childhood education, but it was also about cleaning up the waste and the rorts in the budget. Last year's budget was about a first surplus in 15 years and fighting inflation, but it was also about strengthening Medicare. Last night's was primarily about easing the cost of living, a second surplus and a future made in Australia. But it was also about more homes for Australians. It was about the care economy. It was about broadening opportunity. And this budget was more ambitious without being any less responsible. We had more to do and we had less to do it with, which probably made it the hardest of the three to land. Because along with all of the elements that would have had a familiar ring to you last night, the focus on responsible economic management, the cost of living, renewable energy, the care economy, housing and Medicare, there was also a greater emphasis on security, on investment as well, and more nuance in the fiscal strategy. This budget was all about relief and restraint, and it was about renewal. Relief was the cost of living package for people doing it tough, which is substantial and responsible at the same time. Restraint allowed us to forecast a second surplus to pay down lots of debt and to keep the pressure off inflation, all at the same time as we took important steps to renew our industrial base and our energy base as well. That showed this budget and this government is also about reform. Microeconomic reform to make our economy more efficient and effective, more productive, more dynamic and more competitive. Universities reform and skills and the labour market, transforming our energy base, tax reform and work incentives and incentives to invest, retirement incomes and parental leave, open source geoscience, reforms to modernise government services, changing Commonwealth-state relations, getting value for money in the care economy, mergers reform, big changes to the foreign investment framework, abolishing almost 500 nuisance tariffs to get compliance costs down, ambitious reform by any objective measure. And if you think even just the housing package on its own had targeted interventions for states to address bottlenecks and slash red tape and release more supply, new transport networks and better connected communities so people can live where they can work, additional fee-free TAFE places to train construction workers so we're not as constrained by skills shortages, and reducing the pressure that our education sector is putting on housing by requiring universities to build more accommodation. Now, all of this, I think, is a reminder that the front pages can never adequately capture all of the work and all of the reform in any one budget, which is why I'm so grateful for this chance once again to give you a sense of what we grappled with and how we impose some coherence on all of the complexity and amidst all the commentary. So this budget was about pressures now and priorities for the future. Let me put it this way. Every budget asks us to strike a series of fine balances, but this one was really defined by them, by a sense of balance. And I wanted to give you a few examples of why that's the case. First, we had to keep our balance in the face of complex cross-currents in the global and domestic economy. The lingering impact of 3 crises in 15 years, the pace of social and economic change that's still reverberating through the global economy in often unpredictable ways. There's some welcome resilience in the global economy, but there are warning signs for us as well. Challenges in the Chinese economy, deepening conflict in the Middle East, the persistence of inflation in some advanced economies. All of these pressures reveal an uncertain near-term future, and all while we deal with the longer-term shifts like the net zero transformation, the changing shape of our population, digitisation and geopolitical fragmentation. All of these go to the heart of our future security and prosperity. Now, amidst all of this, Australia has performed really well. Inflation is moderating, real wages are growing, the labour market has been resilient and business investment is strong. But at the same time, the combination of higher interest rates and higher inflation has weighed on our near-term growth prospects, and it's put our people under pressure. Responding to these cross-currents required steady hands when it came to inflation, required hard heads making sure that we are robust and rigorous and getting value for money and putting the budget on a more sustainable footing, and warm hearts, recognising that people are doing it tough and that we had an opportunity but also a responsibility to help where we could. And it also required a series of balanced judgments, balancing our primary objective to help people now and investing in the future at the same time. We know that inflation is easing, but Australians are still hurting, which is why the budget was built on a tax cut for every taxpayer, an average tax cut of $36 a week, bigger tax cuts for more people to help with the cost of living. And on top of that, responsible relief that directly reduces inflation, recognising that cost of living pressures aren't confined to one section of the community, that Middle Australia is impacted as well. And because we're a government for all Australians, we feel the responsibility to help all of our people at the same time as we offer more targeted support for those on lower and fixed incomes as well. So power bill relief for every household, another increase to rent assistance for almost 1 million renters, and freezing the maximum cost of PBS prescriptions are forecast to directly reduce headline inflation by 0.5 percentage point in 2024-25. Now, to use the jargon, this will also help keep inflation expectations anchored, which means that we are supporting monetary policy. Now, while the outlook is uncertain, Treasury's forecasts make it clear that our policies could see inflation return to target earlier, perhaps even by the end of the year, helping to turn the tide for more Australians who are under pressure and who remain the #1 focus of this government. Now, even as we continue to deal meaningfully and responsibly with the pressures of today, most importantly inflation, we're also investing substantially in the future, because our idea of balance doesn't mean standing still. We don't confuse familiarity with security. So the primary purpose of the budget was helping people now and fighting inflation in the process. But the longer sweep and context of the budget is important as well, because we do need to build a new generation of prosperity for our people and our communities, and the budget was about that as well. You've heard it said and you've seen it written before that Australia has had 3 economies. The first was colonial and agricultural. The second was industrial, behind a tariff wall. And the third was created when Paul and Bob opened us up to the global economy without selling out. And what we are now creating together is Australia's 4th economy. By grasping the vast industrial and economic opportunities of the global net zero transformation, making ourselves an indispensable part of it, combining technology and human capital, heavy industries, new industries and the care economy, leveraging our traditional strengths but powered by cleaner and cheaper energy. That's what a future made in Australia is all about. Modernising our economy and maximising our opportunities in a world of churn and change and on a path to net zero. Securing Australia's resilience and prosperity in a changing geostrategic and global economic environment. Now, anything this ambitious will invite a range of responses. I'm relaxed about that. Not all of those responses, in my view, are right. It attracts an exchange of views, and often that exchange of views is robust, and that's almost always a good thing. But what we're attempting here is not about repudiating anyone or anything from the past. We're building on it. The great reformers of the 1980s and 1990s weren't successful because they looked back and reached for the solutions that might have been right for the problems of 40 years prior. They were successful because they looked forward. They were successful because they recognised that the times had changed and the world was changing. They were successful because they were strategic rather than nostalgic, and because they recognised that our guiding light should always be to make our people the big beneficiaries of change. And that's what we're doing, by investing and engaging, not retreating or protecting, so that out of fragmented supply chains and new emerging markets, we can become an indispensable part of that new net zero economy and help power the future in the process. Now, the balance here is between targeted public investment and the much bigger pool of private investment that we hope to attract and unleash, not replace. Not a free-for-all of public spending crowding out private capital, but careful and considered incentives to crowd it in. That's what the Future Made in Australia Act is about as well, imposing the rigour and robustness and the framework, so we can attract and enable private investment. So we can make Australia a renewable energy superpower, value-adding to our resources and strengthening our economic security, backing Australian ideas and innovation in science and technology, and investing in people and place, in skills and education and our suburbs and regions. The Act will help us to make targeted, impactful public investments to get value for money. ARENA will help us commercialise the research and the innovation. Our financing facilities can help de-risk and reduce upfront capital costs for worthy projects. Production tax incentives for green hydrogen and processed critical minerals, which make tax breaks the biggest part of our package, will reward success and scale. And our reforms will improve the regulatory settings and approval processes, create new standards and new markets, and a new front door to make it easier for investors. Now, all of these initiatives will change the way we attract and deploy and improve the flow of capital in our economy and help create that new generation of prosperity for our people. So these are three of the main balances that we had to strike when we were forming up this budget, between global and domestic economic crosscurrents, between cost of living relief now and maximising the opportunities of the future, and between public and private investment. But the balance on which all of these others depended in one way or another was the one that we struck with our fiscal strategy. Now, we have delivered a remarkable positive turnaround in the budget since we came to office. We've done it in a methodical and a considered way, because responsible economic management is a defining feature of this Albanese government, and it's a defining feature of this budget as well. We were determined not to slash and burn while growth is slowing and people are hurting. We were determined to fight inflation without smashing the economy or dismantling essential services. Yes, we've had to grapple with fiscal pressures and unavoidable spending that impacts the bottom line, but that shouldn't diminish all of the progress that we have made over the last 2 years. The fact is, our balanced approach has been achieved alongside a stunning improvement in our nation's finances, including the fastest and biggest improvement of the budget position as a percentage of the economy on record, one of the fastest fiscal consolidations in the G20, and a significantly better budget position and much lower debt compared to our predecessors. To give you a sense of this, since coming to government, we have achieved the first surplus in 15 years, and we're on track for another, something not achieved, as you know now, in nearly 2 decades. Our budget position and our debt position has improved every year and over the medium term compared to what we inherited. We're turning 2 Liberal deficits totalling $135 billion into 2 Labor surpluses, together expected to be more than $30 billion, an improvement of $165 billion in just 2 years. And we have cumulatively improved the budget position by over $215 billion since we came to office. Next year alone, we've shaved nearly $19 billion off the deficit that we inherited for that year, even as we accommodate spending that any reasonable person would consider unavoidable. And we're stabilising and reducing our debt burden sooner than what's occurred after previous economic downturns, with gross debt due to peak at 9.7 percentage points lower than projected at the time when we came to government. Now, none of this would have been possible without taking a much more responsible, restrained and disciplined approach to the budget than the Coalition, returning 96% of revenue upgrades in this budget for this year and 82% over the life of this government, compared to an average of around 40% under our opponents. We've found more than $77 billion worth of savings and reprioritisations, including almost $28 billion just in this budget, compared to zero savings in their last budget. We're restricting real spending growth to an average of 1.4%, compared to 4.1% under our opponents, with net policy decisions in the budget substantially lower than what they managed in March of 2022 when inflation was actually on the way up. So we're outperforming our opponents, we're outperforming the historical norm and other countries when it comes to rebuilding our fiscal buffers. And none of this has come at the expense of helping people or making important investments in the future. And that's linked to another important point, I think, that I want to make here today. There is an understandable focus on the quantity of spending when it comes to talking about budgets, but it's the quality of the spending that matters as well as the timing, the sequencing and the shape of that spending. Some of our spending is automatic, like indexation. Some of it is unavoidable. Much of it is desirable and all of it is warranted. In fact, around 2/3 of the net impact our decisions will have on the budget is due to those unavoidable pressures I mentioned before, so that we can ensure or secure the extension of key health programs like palliative care and cancer support, provide veterans with the support that they need and deserve, sustain the aged care system, improve water security and boost funding for home affairs to address chronic underfunding by our predecessors. The remaining 1/3 of spending is providing cost of living relief for people doing it tough, helping our people through so that we can set them up down the track by making critical investments to create a better, more sustainable care economy, by building the industries of the future, by dedicating more resources towards fixing the housing crisis, including accommodation for women and kids fleeing domestic violence, and by expanding opportunity. So this was not an underinvesting budget. It's not an overspending budget. It's not a smash and grab budget. It's a budget that takes a responsible middle course, balancing the budget this year and last year, building on the stunning turnaround we've engineered in the budget already, and balancing our realism about the pressures that people are under now with our optimism about the future. Now, the complex challenges and changes of the defining decade will require us to work together, and in an ideal world that would also involve a serious and credible opposition that presents a serious and credible alternative about the future. Unfortunately, all we've got so far from the Coalition is negativity and complacency in a moment that demands urgency and optimism. And we've seen that reveal itself in the characteristically shambolic way that they've already responded to the budget, categorising the indexation of pensions as overspending, looking for excuses to oppose energy bill relief for Middle Australia. But their lack of credibility and policy doesn't conceal the difference between us or soften the contrast. It makes the choice, I think, all the clearer. In this budget, we are offering the Australian people cost of living relief which is both substantial and responsible, and a longer-term vision shaped by a profound sense of optimism in what we can achieve together as a country, in a budget that is profoundly better because of our efforts to clean up the mess they left behind. Now, it's long past time for the Coalition to present their plan. They've said there should be deep spending cuts. Well, it's time they say what they will cut. They promised to resurrect the old, skewed Stage 3 tax cuts. It's time to say what that will cost and how they'll pay for it. They said they'd spend even more on defence. It's time to say how much and where the money's coming from. And they've promised a nuclear policy. It's time to tell Australia what that looks like, where the nuclear reactors will go and how all of these promises will add up, so that Australians can decide for themselves which version of the future they prefer. This Coalition clown show of nasty negativity and dead-end complacency, or a new generation of growth and prosperity, which makes our people the primary beneficiaries of the way our society and economy is changing. Now, we have all of the natural advantages we could possibly need to build that future. But the one resource we don't have at our disposal is time to waste. The budget reflects, I think, a real sense of urgency. We've undertaken more significant reform in 2 years than our predecessors managed in close to a decade. And Tuesday's second anniversary of Anthony's government, I think, is a rare opportunity to consider how far we have come together. During that time, we've made huge strides in strengthening Medicare, building our care economy, advancing our housing plan, investing in our clean energy future. It's been 2 years of managing and reforming our economy in the interests of the people. As I've said, we've overseen a more significant and most rapid budget improvement than at any other point in Australia's history, budgeting for back-to-back surpluses, reducing cumulative deficits by around 2/3, taking $150 billion off our national debt this year, saving $80 billion in interest costs, and improving the structural position of the budget by reducing those interest costs and managing the growth of the NDIS. We've set our economy on a much steadier footing. Inflation now is less than half its peak. The creation of 780,000 jobs, more than any other first-term government ever. Wages growing at rates not seen in over a decade, and strong business investment as well. We're making our markets more dynamic, our economy more competitive, our tax system fairer, and our policy foundations stronger. We're modernising our financial system across payments, financial market infrastructure and crypto. We're introducing a new sustainable finance strategy. We're strengthening and streamlining our foreign investment framework. We're delivering a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, returning bracket creep and delivering an economic dividend, making sure that multinationals pay their fair share, that we get a fairer return from our LNG resources, and that super tax concessions are more sustainable. We're working to ensure the objective of super into law and make the system more effective for Australians in retirement, especially women. We're abolishing nuisance tariffs. We're renewing our institutions like the RBA and the Productivity Commission. And we're undertaking the most significant merger reform in half a century. So reform to go with the relief and the restraint. Now, I'm keen to get into your questions, but first I wanted to offer some concluding thoughts. Those of you who have heard me speak in this hall before know that I love the tapestry that is in here. I'm sure the hundreds of people who visit the tapestry in this Parliament House every day say the same thing. But where I think we differ from my appreciation from the big tapestry and others who visit here is because I see something of a budget process in that tapestry. And what I mean by that is a team of people doing painstaking work, where every thread matters on its own, but it still has to come together as a coherent whole. It has to be a close-up and a panorama all at once, and it has to last. And in the 2 years it took 14 craftspeople to weave that magnificent work of art, Halley's Comet passed through the sky. They put it in there, up there in the canopy, capturing a pretty amazing moment in time. Now, that was 38 years ago. And 2 years before that, as Laura referenced in her introduction, in the first budget speech to be televised, as Laura said, Paul did stand in the old Parliament House down the hill, and he said Australia now has before it an historic opportunity to embark upon a new growth path. And think of all of the change that Australia has known since then. It wasn't the easy road that we took, and it wasn't the familiar course. But the courage of Australians to make a new way forward set our nation up for the longest continuous run of economic growth in our history. And together now, we can choose a new path to prosperity, not by doubling back, but by going forward together, making the most of the geographical, geological, meteorological, geopolitical and industrial cards that we have been dealt, making our people the biggest beneficiaries of all of that churn and change in the world around us, and taking this golden opportunity which is presenting itself to us in the defining decade, so that we are more secure and we are more prosperous and we are more confident with more cause for optimism in the Australian future that we all make together. The budget last night was central to that effort, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions about it now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Treasurer. You've spent the last...
I don't think you've got mic there.
I've got mic problems, so... thank you, Treasurer. You've spent the last 24 hours or so, in particular, trying to persuade everybody of the merits of the budget. But I'd just like to do a slight bit of role play here and see if I could get you to tell us how you're going to persuade Michelle Bullock about the merits of what you've done. As you say, the energy rebate and other measures will, by a mechanical reduction in the inflation rate. But can you just tell us what else in the budget will help reduce inflationary pressures? For example, what's your feeling about a halving of migration? Does that actually add to inflation or take away from it? And are there other factors we should be considering and that she should be considering?
Thanks, Laura. I'll try and deal efficiently with what I think are probably three parts of that question. First of all, in relation to the Reserve Bank. All of you working journalists in the room know that I don't make predictions or preempt decisions taken independently by the Reserve Bank. They will weigh up a whole range of factors, and the Commonwealth budget won't be the only factor that they weigh up. They'll weigh up global and domestic conditions and a whole bunch of other considerations as well. I don't tell Governor Bullock how to do her job. She doesn't tell me how to do my job. We do compare notes and we discuss the fiscal position. We discussed the government strategy. I've been able to brief her along with the Treasury Secretary on the budget in advance of handing it down. That is, I think, the normal part of working closely together as we both, in our own domains, do what we can to put downward pressure on inflation. Which brings me to the second part of your question. One of the reasons why inflation has moderated so substantially, not the only reason, but a key reason, is because when we came to office and inflation had a 6 in front of it, now it's got a 3 in front of it. We have gone out of our way to manage the budget in the most responsible way that we can, getting the budget in much better nick, making inflation our primary focus. And that applies to the design of our cost of living relief as well. And there has been an effort, I think, to kind of recategorise and redefine and reclassify what inflation is in our economy. I think people understand in the communities of this country that if you get power bills down and you get rent a little bit down, that puts downward pressure on inflation, and that's what matters. And the very firm advice from our departments was that the budget, and particularly the cost of living package, will put downward pressure on inflation without adding to inflationary pressures elsewhere in the economy. Third part of your question was about migration, and you're right to remind our guests here that there is a fairly substantial moderation in migration built into the budget. Net overseas migration next year will be half what it was last year. We had that spike in the post-COVID period, which was primarily students and long-term tourists, and that meant the numbers were a bit higher, and now they're moderating to more normal levels. I think most people would recognise that migration's got an important role to play in our economy, but it needs to be well managed, and we need to make sure that we can manage the pressures. We've got a big housing package, a big infrastructure package, and also in migration more specifically, we've ended the COVID visa. The colleagues are managing the student intake more appropriately, and all of that is helping as well. We're seeing a substantial moderation in inflation in the forecasts and in the last couple of years as well, and that is largely because of how we're managing the budget, but it will also be increasingly about how we're managing the population as well.
David Crowe has a question.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Treasurer, for your speech. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age of Melbourne. A question on the big picture with this budget, which is that federal payments are due to go up in the next 2 years to 26.6% of GDP. Now, according to the historical data in the budget papers, that's the highest level in 38 years outside the 2 years of the pandemic. So my question is, where is the emergency that justifies payments going to that level? Why is it not possible for you and your Cabinet colleagues to decide the spending priorities in a way that keep overall payments down back to more normal levels?
Yeah. Thanks, David, for your important question. This is about partly about unavoidable spending. There was a whole bunch of stuff in the budget that Katie has spoken about on other occasions, and you've been there for that. There have been a lot of terminating programs in the health system or things like MyGov. which I think any reasonable person would assume is an ongoing program, but was only funded temporarily by our predecessors. We've had to extend that. We've done our best to explain why that is necessary. That's part of the story. Payments have also gone up over the last couple of years because a lot of our social security system, for example, in good and appropriate ways, is based on indexation. When we've had this higher inflation than usual, that's part of the reason that drives our payments. That's why it's quite absurd, frankly, that Angus Taylor describes the indexation of the age pension, for example, in a category of things he describes as overspending. Indexation plays a role. But what really matters here, I think, when it comes to getting the budget into much better nick, in addition to the savings we've talked about, in addition to those two surpluses, is real spending growth. Because real spending growth takes into consideration indexation of payments and the like. And real spending growth is a fraction of what it was before. 1.4% over the 6 years covered by our government and our three budgets, 1.4%. And that is dramatically lower than the 4.1% we saw under our predecessors, and it's around half of what we've seen in the 30-year average. So I'd encourage you to check out what we're doing with real spending growth restraint in combination of savings, banking upward revision in revenue, delivering those two surpluses, avoiding $80 billion in interest repayments on the debt.
Claire Armstrong.
Thanks for your speech today, Treasurer. Claire Armstrong from the Daily Telly, Courier Mail, Herald Sun and Adelaide Advertiser. I remember last year. Ahead of the last election, Labor promised its Powering Australia plan would, quote, cut power bills for families and businesses by $275 a year for homes by 2025 compared to today. So based on the latest default market offers for the next year, even with a $300 rebate, the average typical household power bill will be between $275 and $727 higher than that target. So is it time now to concede that that promise can't be kept?
Well, I think part of the answer to your question, Claire, is in the question itself. You are referring to a 2025 outcome based on a 2021 forecast. And we found a way to help people with their energy bills right now in 2024 when the pressure's on. We did it in the last budget. We've done it in a more substantial way in this budget. And it's a really crucial part of our cost of living package. If you look at the cost of living package presented last night, a tax cut for every taxpayer, energy bill relief for every household, assistance with rent and medicine costs. This is all about taking pressure off people. And the benefit for every household will be greater than the forecast that you have just described in your question.
Phil Curry.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, Treasurer. Just back to Laura's question. Ask it a different way, if I could. If your CPI does fall back within the 2 to 3% band, as the budget now predicts, by Christmas or not much later, can you see any reason why the RBA shouldn't cut rates?
Well, part of my answer is the same as what I've given to Laura today and you on other occasions, and probably 600 or 700 times to your colleagues here in the course of the last 2 years. There are good reasons why treasurers don't get involved in that kind of prediction or preempting decisions taken independently. I take responsibility for my part of this, and my part of this, working with Katie and our team and Anthony and others, is to make sure we're doing what we can to manage the budget responsibly and put downward pressure on inflation. I'm confident that that's what we've done in this budget. Inflation has come off really substantially over the course of the last couple of years, but it's not mission accomplished because people are still hurting. And so that's why the budget's got a big focus on the cost of living and fighting inflation. We will do our bit. The Reserve Bank will take its decisions independently, and that's appropriate.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Treasurer, can I take you to the future Made in Australia policy? Critics have said that that policy needs exit ramps for when investments turn out to be suboptimal and to protect taxpayers. Now, you've outlined in the budget a framework, you've mentioned that today, but could you elaborate in a bit more detail, please, what these protections will be, what are the off-ramps, why people should have confidence that their money won't just go up in smoke?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Michelle, and for the opportunity to talk about what I think is a really important and really ambitious and substantial agenda. The best way, or the most prominent way, to understand the off-ramps that we've built into the design of our Future Made in Australia package is if you think about that $22.7 billion that we're investing over the course of the next 10 years, the majority of that is production tax credits for renewable hydrogen and for refining and processing critical minerals. Now, in both of those instances, and you asked me about off-ramps, in both of those instances, the support that we are providing via the tax system has an endpoint. And so what we're committing to there in the two biggest pieces by far of the Future Made in Australia package are production tax credits that end when the market for these kinds of important minerals and energy sources is what people anticipate to be normalised. And so, for example, when it comes to the hydrogen production tax credit, that ends in 2039-40. When it comes to the critical minerals production tax credit, similarly, that ends there. And that's how we don't saddle the budget forever with these really important production tax credits. That's the sort of off-ramp that we have been working on and considering, and the sorts of off-ramps that Danielle Wood and others have talked about in the past.
Andrew Clennell.
Treasurer Andrew Clennell from Sky. The budget papers say, quote, the cash rate is assumed to gradually ease from around the middle of 2025 to reach 3.6% by the middle of 2026. Do you agree with that no rate cut until mid-2025? And given Stephen Kennedy, who's behind me, is on the Reserve Bank board, is 2.75% inflation by Christmas a Stephen Kennedy prediction or a Jim Chalmers prediction?
Well, on the first bit of your question, it's a good opportunity to remind everyone that the interest rate assumptions in the budget are just informed by the Bloomberg survey of market economists. You know, the Treasury has to make an assessment. Ben's nodding because I've just given his employer a big rap and mentioning that we trust that we rely on the information from the Bloomberg survey. But the Treasury has to make an assumption about the future trajectory of interest rates. The fairest, most appropriate way to do that is to let the survey of market economists inform that. So that's the first part of your question. On the inflation forecasts, of course that they are Treasury forecasts in the usual way that Treasury forecasts all elements of the economy for governments of both political persuasions. We don't sit in our office and write the forecasts. The Treasury team of very professional, very diligent people do that work for governments of both political persuasions. And what the Treasury forecasts recognise, in a way that wasn't possible because of the timing of the Reserve Bank forecasts, is that our Treasury forecasts for inflation factor in what we're doing with the cost of living package and what we're doing with the broader fiscal settings. And that is the main reason why they are anticipating that inflation will get back to the target band sooner than they were anticipating at Christmas time.
Mark Riley.
Treasurer Mark Riley from the Seven Network. I want to ask about the decision not to means test the energy rebate and the result of that being that the ultra-rich get it not just once. If they have 4 or 5 homes, they might get it 4 or 5 times, wacky-do. Your explanation has been that the energy retailers are unable to identify people by income and therefore won't be able to means test it. But haven't they already done that, Treasurer? Aren't they doing that this year with people who are on low incomes and pensioners and others? And isn't that data with the ATO and with Centrelink? And can't that be shared? And in the age of AI, quantum computing and future technologies, can't we do that?
Okay, so on the difference between the last energy bill rebates and the ones we announced last night, there is actually a difference between identifying people on pensions and payments, which was the targeting of the first one, and means testing by income. it is actually a very different way of means testing and targeting. The two ways that you can do it with the existing systems are either people on pensions and payments or the whole cohort, every household. The ATO has tax information, but they have no arrangements to share that with energy retailers. We would have to change fundamentally the data sharing arrangements. That would take time and money in order to do that. So the judgment that we made was that the most efficient way to give cost of living relief to people on low and fixed incomes, but also people on middle incomes, to provide that cost of living relief in Middle Australia as well, was to provide it to every household. Now, people on the highest incomes are not our focus, they're not our concern, but in the absence of redesigning or designing a new system of data sharing and means testing amongst the energy retailers, we made the assessment that the best way to do it was to provide it broadly. There are two elements of the cost of living package which are provided broadly: a tax cut for every taxpayer and energy relief for every household. And there are elements of the cost of living package that are more targeted. Almost 1 million renters get rent assistance. People on the concession cards in the PBS get a longer freeze in the cost of medicines. Students get debt relief. Two broad parts of the cost of living package and some targeting as well elsewhere.
David Spears.
Treasurer, thanks for your speech. David Spears from the ABC. I just want to go to your Future Made in Australia plan. Treasury released this supporting paper last night alongside the budget.
It's a little bit, yeah.
It wasn't anything I said, I hope.
Yeah.
You better just explain.
I'm sure it's unrelated to Future Made in Australia.
I don't take it personally at all, David.
Look, this supporting paper from Treasury looks at the various elements of your Future Made in Australia plan. I think it's fair to say it's perhaps more enthusiastic about some areas than others. For example, Treasury says when it comes to green hydrogen, there is a strong case for producing green hydrogen in Australia, tick. It says Australia has significant potential to become one of the lowest cost producers of green metals, tick. It says when it comes to processing critical minerals, well, they may require public support, but when it comes to making solar panels and batteries in Australia, it points out, yes, there's a lot of concentration with this in China, but the US, Europe, India, France, others are getting into this game, and if we have strong trade relationships with them, we should be fine. It does not say there's a strong case to make solar panels and batteries in Australia. So my question is, did you seek Treasury's advice before you committed $1.5 billion to solar panel and battery making, and what was their advice?
Well, of course, in the normal process of advising us for the Expenditure Review Committee and the Cabinet, of course the Treasury provides advice. And I think what you see in that document is recognition that the kinds of investments that we are making are appropriate in one of two ways, or often in both of the two ways. That paper that you have got in your hands there, I think that might be the only document I didn't bring with me, separates the opportunities into two streams. The first stream is the net zero stream, the other stream is about economic resilience and national security, and different opportunities apply to the different streams. But what you see in the package that we announced, the $22.7 billion of investment over 10 years, is recognition in the magnitude of our investment that some of these opportunities are further developed than others. And that reflects the commentary in that paper that you have there, and it reflects the Treasury advice. You know, there were two opportunities, we think, clean renewable hydrogen and processing and refining critical minerals, which were ready and warranted production tax credits, for example. Some of the other technologies warrant a different combination of levers that we're using, whether it's ARENA innovation funding or some other ways. And that reflects the really quite detailed and considered work and thought that the Treasury put into our finalising this policy that we released last night.
Poppy Johnson.
Thanks, Treasurer. Poppy Johnson from AAP. At a time when we're trying to lower energy costs as well as lower emissions, could the billions spent on power bill rebates have been better spent incentivising more households to install solar EVs and electric appliances, as some have suggested? And if not now, would you consider more help for household electrification down the track?
Yeah. Thanks, Poppy. I mean, we have taken some decisions in earlier budgets to support the electrification of households and small businesses, and we're proud that we have done that. I think we collectively recognise that there is an opportunity to do more when we can afford to do that and where we can do that responsibly. We have shown an appetite, and I shout out my colleagues Jenny McAllister and Chris Bowen and others, an appetite to support families and pensioners to make the transition at the same time as we get the whole economy to make this important transition and transformation as well. And so we are prepared to consider in the future any further steps that we may need to take on the front that you described, but we've also done some things already in earlier budgets.
And somewhat belatedly, I'm just going to explain for our TV audience, the sound of those bells are the sounds of a division in the House of Representatives. They ring for 3 or 4 minutes, and there was a bit of an evacuation of members of the House, including the Prime Minister, to go and vote in the chamber. Our next question is from Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News. It's like we timed it, Poppy, because I also want to ask on that issue. The Biden administration has just spent $7 billion putting solar panels on the roofs of low-income households, and your one-off energy bill rebates are going to cost $3.5 billion. Rewiring Australia has said you could help electrify every household in Australia for $12 billion, and it says that's roughly what the government currently spends subsidising fossil fuels. So why did you go for the sugar hit when you could have had a long-term cost reduction for the people, as you say, who are under the pump?
Well, the quickest, most meaningful way that we could provide relief was to provide that energy bill rebate for every household. But that hasn't prevented us from moving really substantially and in an ambitious way when it comes to electrification, when it comes to renewables at the household level. As I said in response to Poppy's question, we've had initiatives in our first couple of budgets which are about households. We've had incentives for small business as well. And we have indicated, I hope before, because I've done it today, we have indicated an appetite and a willingness to consider in future budgets some of the proposals like that one that you described.
Charles Croucher.
Thank you, Treasurer. You've called this a defining decade. It could also be called a decade of debt. $1 trillion in the next 2 years, $26 billion a year interest payments, and moving forward beyond that. Given Anthony Albanese has now left the room, has it crossed your mind that one day a Prime Minister Chalmers may regret Treasurer Chalmers not doing more when it comes to debt? And before you think that's a compliment, I mean Annabelle, Leo or Jack as Prime Minister, because that's how long we're going to be paying back this debt without structural change.
I think Prime Minister Annabelle Chalmers is far more likely than this generation. One of the things I'm proudest of in this budget and the first 2 budgets, and again I share credit with my terrific colleague in the front row here, one of the most meaningful differences that we have made in our time in office is to get that debt bill down really substantially. In 1 year alone, this year, gross debt is $152 billion lower. Next year, it's $183 billion lower. We're avoiding $80 billion of debt interest repayments that the Jacks and Leos and Annabelles and their generation would have to pay back. And so if you made a list of the substantial achievements of Anthony's government in the 2 years that we've been in office, at or near the top of that list would be this stunning turnaround in public finances that we have helped engineer. And the dividend from that, one of the consequences of that, is debt is much lower than it would otherwise be, and that means debt interest is much lower than it would otherwise be. And so that money can go to repairing the budget further, or it can go to investing in our priorities, including some of these priorities which were in the budget last night and which your colleagues are asking me about today.
Patrick Commons.
Thanks, Treasurer. Patrick Commons from the Australian newspaper. You mentioned the pressures of unavoidable spending in the budget. Does this include more generous Commonwealth funding with the states for schools and hospitals? And the problem with saying something is unavoidable, it suggests other spending is avoidable. So maybe you can tell us what is the avoidable spending, and if unavoidable pressures are so intense, shouldn't you be doing more to tackle those avoidable spending pressures?
Well, we have been, Patrick. I mean, we've found $78 billion in savings and reprioritisations. And lest people here think that that is a small amount of savings, I remind you again that the March 2022 budget had $0 in savings. So an extra $80 billion in savings, that's hard work. And we take that really seriously. Katie and I get asked all of the time, you know, is this budget going to be the budget that's really responsible and it's got savings in it? And we say no, every budget. We're looking for more effective ways to invest public money, and $80 billion is a demonstration of our bona fides on that front, and there'll be more in the future. In every budget there'll be opportunities. Whether it's the way we make room in the investment pipeline in defence, whether it is the savings that Katie's been making in contractors and consultants, we have shown a willingness and an appetite and an ability to cut spending where we need to and redirect it. When it comes to unavoidable spending, I mean, if you put yourselves in the shoes of an expenditure review committee minister or a cabinet minister, and what sits before you often is a terminating program which literally no person in this room would consider to be a temporary program. You know, the idea, for example, that MyGov was only funded temporarily and that somehow we could have avoided paying to extend it beyond when it was budgeted to terminate, I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. And so a big part of the extra spending next year, a big part of the reason why the deficit is a little bit bigger next year than we anticipated at MyEFO is because of the kinds of spending that nobody in this room would want to try and avoid.
Katina Curtis.
Thanks. Katina Curtis from the West Australian. There have been some over time, including previous heads of Treasury, who've said Australia's not done very well at extracting a public cut for the use of the resources that, when they're in the ground, everyone owns. How, when you're thinking about getting an entire new resources sector off the ground, how are you thinking about making sure that the public does get a fair cut from this new industry?
Well, our biggest priority in this regard is the PRRT legislation before the House and before the Senate. And that's all about ensuring that our offshore LNG producers are paying more tax sooner to help fund our other priorities. When it comes to these new opportunities in renewable hydrogen and refining and processing critical minerals, our emphasis there in the tax system is making sure that we make the most of this opportunity, that we attract investment. And it goes back a little bit to Michelle Grattan's question from much earlier in the questions and answers. You know, where we are providing those tax breaks and those incentives, we need to make sure that there's an off-ramp as well, and that's what we've built into the system. I am confident, very confident, that the sort of industrial base that we are trying to recreate in this country will have a lot of benefits, good, secure, well-paid jobs in suburbs and regions, and that generation of prosperity. And if we get that right, there will be a benefit for the budget as well.
Ben Westcott.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thanks for your speech, Treasurer, and thanks for reminding everyone about the great work that Bloomberg does. In your Future Made in Australia plan, you have tax breaks for critical minerals and hydrogen starting in the 27-28 financial year. Now, when asked about that timeline previously, you've said that it needs time for the processing capabilities to ramp up. Now, that's obviously the case for hydrogen, but for critical minerals, we already have some processing capabilities that probably could do with a tax incentive. Why not fund them now?
Well, first of all, some of the challenges that we've got in critical minerals right now are at the mining end, and that is the consequence, as you know, and we've talked about it before, as a consequence of the way that the market is responding to a heap more supply and the way that market is being managed by others. So that's the near-term challenge. That's primarily a challenge for mining rather than refining and processing. 2027 is not that far away, but the timing recognises that these two incentives that you're asking about, they pay on results, they pay on production, they pay on scale and success. And we don't yet have the kind of production right now that we're talking about, trying to incentivise. And so 2027 strikes the right balance. It's near enough to be meaningful, but it's far enough away that it recognises that we are paying for scale and success and production, not just not for investment at the front end.
Chloe Boris.
Thank you, Treasurer. Chloe Boris from Network 10. You said at the start of your speech that budgets get notoriously oversimplified, so I'm going to ask you to simplify it.
It wasn't a challenge, Chloe.
Well, how will you measure the success of this budget? Is it an interest rate cut? Is it an election victory? Because those budget papers have election written all over them.
I think well, first of all, I don't accept that last part of your question. And in fairness to you, Chloe, almost everybody of your colleagues and counterparts here have asked me a version of that question last night or in about a dozen or 15 or whatever interviews we did this morning. I don't see this budget in political terms. And a lot of you have asked me, is this the last budget of the parliamentary term? My answer to that is I'm expecting to do another one. I'm happy to do another one. Katie and I are ready and raring to go for another one already. We've already started thinking about next year's budget the day after this one, but that's in the hands of Prime Ministers. We know our place in these kinds of considerations, and I will hand down a budget on the day that my Prime Minister tells me to. I'm anticipating that it will be on this side of an election, but that is for him to decide. You asked me what determines the success of this budget. I determine the success of everything that we do as about two things. Are we making life a little bit easier for people? And we are in this budget. And are we positioning our people to be the big beneficiaries and not the victims of the way that the world is changing? And, all of us have a different reason for being here. My reason for being here is because I like to think about how the world is changing and how we make Australia the big winner out of that change. That's what the Future Made in Australia package is all about, but that's what really, in one way or another, all of our policies are about. Beneficiaries of change rather than victims of change. And there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress in our communities, a lot of uncertainty, the community that I represent, the communities that others represent in this place, and not even just on our side of the parliament. We know that people can be anxious and uncertain about the future, and our job as a government, in addition to helping people through difficult times and managing the pressures that they are under, is to maximise the opportunities of the future. And I judge that by our ability to keep people front and centre, to maintain our focus on real people in real communities, how they're faring now and how their kids will fare in the future.
Paul Carp.
Thanks very much. The government's own poverty experts called for a timetable to increase JobSeeker, but the budget you've handed down shows there's no increase when inflation is above target, no increase when inflation is back within the target, no increase when you deliver a surplus this year, and no increase when you deliver bigger deficits in following years. You say you will consider it when it's responsible to do so, so my question isn't when. My question, please, what would the economy and budget need to look like for you to further increase JobSeeker?
Thanks, Paul, for your question and for your interest in this over a long period of time. And you're right that we have been able to implement some but not all of the recommendations of the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee. I think what's missing from the question is recognition that we increased in a permanent way the JobSeeker payment in the last budget, and not because we think that doing that in the last budget necessarily solved all of the pressures that people on JobSeeker are under. We know that people are under pressure, and that's why we've found so many different ways to provide cost of living relief to people who are vulnerable, people on low and fixed incomes and people on JobSeeker. Whether it's the energy rebate, whether it is the consecutive increases now to the Commonwealth Rent Assistance, or all of the other ways, medicines and the like. We think that there is more than one way to help people who are vulnerable and people who are on low and fixed incomes. We have found multiple ways to do that across multiple budgets now, and we understand that good Labor governments with hard heads and warm hearts into the future will do what they can to always help the most vulnerable people in our society.
This next question from Finn McHugh will have to be our last, unfortunately.
Thanks, Treasurer. Finn McHugh at Capital Brief. On this idea of forcing universities to stump up for accommodation if they want to take extra international students, that's obviously got to be worked out with the sector over a period of time. I'm wondering what time frame we're looking at, what consultation's already been done and how much blowback you expect from the sector.
Well, we would like the universities to be willing partners in building more homes, in their case for students and in our case for Australians more broadly. I think that there is a recognition that there's a shortage of student accommodation, and that is putting pressure on the housing market more broadly. It's not the only reason why there's pressure on the housing market, but it's a reason why there's pressure on the housing market. And that's why when my colleagues negotiate with universities how we manage growth in this really important part of the economy, international education, a sector that I support really quite enthusiastically. But as we manage that growth in foreign students, to make sure as part of that, whether it's some kind of formula, some kind of ratio, some kind of agreement over a set period of time, that we're building more student accommodation to take pressure off the private rental market. A lot of those details will be worked through with the sector, including the timing, and we hope and expect that together we can make a real difference when it comes to student accommodation. To give you a sense of where this decision came from, and this is a bit more kind of context than I think the budget papers or the press releases might provide, but you'll recall, if you followed the Universities Accord, that one of the ideas was about whether or not we tax or apply a levy to foreign students. And one of the reasons that was given for that levy was we could use that money then to build more student accommodation. And we think it's more efficient, frankly, instead of taking that fee and then spending it on student accommodation and then having the universities manage it, is to say to the universities, if you want to bring in a certain amount of foreign students, that's good for you, it's good for our community, it's good for our economy, but it needs to be good for our housing market as well, and we'll negotiate the best way to do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the Treasurer for speaking to us today.
And that was the Treasurer speaking in the Great Hall of Parliament House with his traditional post-budget address. This only one of many attempts by Jim Chalmers to communicate what's in his economic plan and to explain the thinking behind it. Those attempts began before dawn this morning here in Canberra. I'm Greg Jennett, coming to you from the ABC's Parliament House studios, only a couple of floors above the Great Hall. Between now and question time, just over 20 minutes away, we're going to look over the Treasurer's address and other outstanding issues from the budget. Incidentally, one that appears to have caused a little angst is budget savings in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. NDIS Minister Bill Shorten is going to join us soon to answer some questions about those changes, may be able to put at ease some of the concerns that are bubbling out there. But joining us now for some analysis, our National Affairs Editor, Melissa Clark. Mel, welcome back. The budget's kind of settling into the absorption phase now. Everyone knows roughly what's in it for them. Most questions seem to go to the headline issue of energy bill relief and around means testing. Why is it being sprayed across each and every household in Australia? What's the Treasurer's main take in that answer?
Look, you're absolutely right to point to that as being the part that everyone is talking about in the many interviews that the Treasurer referenced in his speech there that he's done this morning. That is the message they want everyone to get, that every household's getting a tax cut, every household is getting energy bill relief, but that has consistently raised the question of, well, does everyone really need that sort of support? Sure, low-income earners might need some help, and even middle-income earners, but there are plenty of wealthy people for whom $300 on their power bill over the course of the year is neither here nor there, and why have you designed a system that gives away money to them? It's a consistent and fair question. Jim Chalmers is trying to explain it by talking about the issues they have with trying to roll out this sort of cost of relief measure quickly. The time is a factor, and therefore you need to work within systems that they already have, and the systems he says they currently have are, we know who's on a pension or a payment system from the government, but if you're not on that system, it's much harder to get energy companies to know who's a high-income earner, who's a middle-income earner, and I think he tried to set that out in the speech today.
We might just pick that up. I do think we have the Treasurer from the Great Hall. Why don't we just see how he answered it himself?
Judgment that we made was that the most efficient way to give cost of living relief to people on low and fixed incomes, but also people on middle incomes, to provide that cost of living relief in Middle Australia as well, was to provide it to every household. Now, people on the highest incomes are not our focus, they're not our concern, but in the absence of redesigning or designing a new system of data sharing and means testing amongst the energy retailers, we made the assessment that the best way to do it was to provide it broadly. There are two elements of the cost of living package which are provided broadly: a tax cut for every taxpayer and energy relief for every household. And there are elements of the cost of living package that are more targeted. Almost 1 million renters get rent assistance. People on the concession cards in the PBS get a longer freeze in the cost of medicines. Students get debt relief. Two broad parts of the cost of living package and some targeting as well elsewhere.
All right, so straight from the Treasurer's own mouth, as you were saying, Mel, it's a mechanical thing about who holds information in the energy sector on incomes that Australians earn. There are other perverse outcomes, though, aren't there, when you look at someone who might own multiple properties? Again, that was put to the Treasurer, but they seem to think efficiency trumps all, right?
It seems to be the argument that the way they want to do it is where the energy bill where the energy bill goes, and if you have multiple properties, you might have an energy bill going to multiple properties. But I think that's also important to note. Not just is it a time efficiency, this is also an effort to get the funding into the bill itself before it reaches the household. They don't want to send a cheque of $300 to an individual. They might go off and spend it on something else, which would be inflationary. This is a way to get the electricity bill down, which will bring those headline inflation figures down too. So there's a bit of, I think, financial mechanical side of it just as much as there is a distribution mechanical side of it too.
I'm sure there is more we can talk about, and we will, Mel, between now and question time. As we flagged earlier, we are holding our coverage from Parliament House through until 2 o'clock. But we do have a special guest joining us now. As we mentioned at the beginning of our coverage, NDIS participants are making contact, expressing some misgivings about savings on that budget, a budget which currently runs at above $44 billion a year. NDIS Minister Bill Shorten joins us now. Minister, thanks for coming back. I know it's been hectic between the Great Hall, the Parliament itself, and now upstairs here to the press gallery. That you're seeking to contain growth in NDIS costs isn't any real surprise. After all, you struck a deal with the states in conjunction with your review. But that limit on growth doesn't start, does it, until 2026, and you've got $5.8 billion in savings in just the next 2 years before we get to 2026. Participants follow this. Some seem surprised by what's been plugged into last night's budget. Explain to them what practical changes lie ahead as you pursue those cumulative savings over 4 years of $14.4 billion.
Two practical changes, but just let me put a little bit of context to reassure participants. The scheme's here to stay under Labor. We want to make sure every dollar gets through to the participants for whom the scheme was designed. We've also said for the last 2 years we want it to be sustainable for future generations. The scheme is growing at nearly 20%. That's just not realistic. Now, I think a lot of that, the very high part of that growth rate is due to overcharging, underservice, not a focus on outcomes. We believe with two practical changes, we can head towards growth at 8% rather than nearly 20%. And something's got to be done. The do-nothing option is not an option. So two practical changes. One, at the moment we're seeing an outbreak of intra-plan inflation. I'm sorry, the NDIS has more jargon than
you can explain that,
than a moonshot. But intra-plan inflation means that you get a plan for a period of time, say for 12 months. What's happening is some participants are being encouraged to spend all their money within 4 or 5 months, and then there's an automatic top-up. That's not on. Some plans do need to change and be increased because perhaps the electric wheelchair's broken or the initial plan didn't assess the needs properly. But this sort of automatic top-up, which is being fuelled by an element of the planning industry saying spend your money and you'll just get more, that's got to stop automatically.
So you are turning that off as a feature.
The automatic assumption that if you spend all your money, you can just be topped up. That's just not realistic. It's not the way the world works, and it doesn't serve the best interests of people with disability, because it puts a premium on. So we think that we don't think we've forecast that will deliver significant improvements in the next 4 years, starting from this next year.
That will, people will feel that from the 1st of July.
Well, not really. When you think about it, if we're spending, we've budgeted, and again, this is just a reassured participants, we're saying it was $42 billion this year, and we're saying it'll be $46 billion plus next year. That's not a cut of money. What we're saying is it shouldn't be $48 billion. Like, there's a difference between a cut and just not spending as much.
Yeah, we're using the word carefully here, a saving. It's a saving against the most recent budget forecast.
If growth's up here, we want growth to be here, but it'd still be well above the status quo.
All right, take us to the second
The second change is a proposal made by the 12-month review we did into the whole scheme. And what they say is that the way the scheme had been constructed over the last number of years is it's plans, people get an individual package, it's built bottom up, so item by item. So you might have a whole lot of items in your scheme. And what that's leading to a focus on increasing the price of the inputs. What we want to do is hire trained assessors, and we want to look at a person's total needs. And instead of constructing a plan brick by brick, we look at a person's overall needs and give them a budget. We estimate that's actually going to save money. I use a simple analogy. If you were building a house and the builder can charge you for every brick, every windowsill, every tap, that's a pretty cumbersome way to work out your budget. Far better to sit down with the builder and say, this is the house we want. And the builder says, I think I can build it for this. If you have a whole lot of ingredients from the bottom up, you just create a whole lot of extra opportunity to see cost blowouts.
Of the $14.4 billion in savings over 4 years, can you describe to us the relative weight of measure 1, which is cutting off intra-plan inflation, and measure 2 that you just summarised for us there using the brick by brick?
95% of our savings over the next 4 years will come from these two measures.
And the relative weight of each of them, does intra-plan inflation amount to more than
roughly 2/3 of the savings of that number I just gave is intra-plan inflation. 1/3 will be by changing the way we set budgets to begin with.
I imagine you can't say that no one will be worse off under their plans because of these changes. Can you say that?
No, these plans, if we did nothing, a person's plan could go up or down. So no one can guarantee that there's never any change. That's not the way the scheme works. But these plans will just stop artificial inflation where, I mean, the vast majority of service providers are excellent, but there are some service providers who are having a lend. We want to move the whole scheme, and this is what people with disability have told us, to base it on outcomes for people, not the inputs, which of course then can be, some people will just increase the price of.
Do you acknowledge a degree of surprise among participants here? So associated with your bill and the review were promises for co-design and for consultation, and yet these two measures you're describing to us today, Bill, do appear on our reckoning to have taken participants by surprise. How would they have known?
Well, first of all, I understand why people with disability are anxious when there's any discussion of change, because whatever the imperfections of the NDIS, it's a lot better than what there was beforehand. So I can understand as soon as people hear change, they don't hear the word change for them. They say, oh, what do I lose? The reality is that we're budgeting for the scheme to increase in expenditure, to increase in growth, to increase in numbers. But the scheme is growing too quickly, and there are features of the scheme which are not helping people with disability or the taxpayer. I ask myself one question, does our change help people with disability? Yes. Now, setting up the needs-based, changing the way we do budget setting, that doesn't come in until we've done co-design. What we're doing is just creating the legal basis to have the conversation about co-design. So that'll be done with co-design. In terms of this automatic top-up intra-plan inflation, that's been something which has been forced on us by the fact that there are some people out there, service providers, saying to people, spend your money and we can just top it up. We just want to shut down a loophole before it becomes a giant, gaping wound.
Does this mean that these $14.4 billion alone won't get you where you want to be, which is 8% growth in funding by 2026? You're running at 20. is there more pain on the way for participants or the scheme more broadly as you bridge that gap from 20 down to 8? This isn't going to get you there, is it?
No, I love political journalism, and you're asking obviously the right questions. But the first round of questions was that we're going too hard, and this question is, are you going hard enough? And that's I'm a volunteer.
Well, it's really might you have to go harder?
Well, we've got other reforms. We have other
goals.
reforms, but for these next few years, this is key stuff. We're also doing the crackdown on fraud. There was provisions in last night's budget to improve our scrutiny of people who are not doing the right thing, unethical behaviour, illegal behaviour, so that's there. We also said last night that we're going to develop with the states a system of foundational supports. That is, supports for people with disability who don't qualify to be on the NDIS but still need some support. That's all going to take time. This is, the analogy I would use is, you remember the scenes of the big shipping tanker which was caught in the Suez Canal, and it took a lot of effort to sort of move it around a bit. That's what we're trying to do to the scheme, just get it on track. As for how it affects individual participants, I'm absolutely committed. The scheme is going to increase in numbers and we're increasing the investment in it. But I do think that it doesn't have to grow at 20%. I think that's over the top and we need to bring it to a more reasonable growth level.
All right, and just to round out our understanding or appreciation of where these measures in last night's budget came from, where their genesis was, you do cite in the budget papers a review by the official actuary for the NDIS. That came forward, I think, in early December to you, and lo and behold, that found that you were running $14.4 billion. So is what you're running over by $14.4 billion, is what's been published in this budget purely matching up against that number? As you get further estimates from the actuary, you may have to find more to match those.
I think what's been driving some of the intra-plan inflation, remember that's why I said people just seeking to top up, is I think some support coordinators and some plan managers who advise people on the scheme have seen that we're fair income about reforming the scheme. So I think it's led to a premature rush for the exit to try and get a little bit more because people are worried that somehow they won't get that. I just say to people, we want to have a more accountable scheme. The scheme is going to be ongoing. So what we're seeing is a spike in this growth.
That was an unintended consequence of your
As soon as you
review,
talk about reform, between when you start talking about it and when you can legislate it and do the co-design, there are some people who say, oh, I better get as much as I can now in case I don't. You know, it's a sort of squirrel theory for winter, load up on the old acorns. But we'll work it through with people. No one should be perturbed because what this is doing is, if we do nothing, as some perhaps in the extreme elements of the disability sector or some service providers say, the scheme will eventually not be there. So we've got to do something to just make it a bit trimmer, but we are. It's still demand driven, it's still focusing on people, and this is all being owned by the sector itself.
Understood, Bill Shorten, and we appreciate you fronting up to explain it. It is responsive to some audience feedback.
No, I want to reassure participants, so it's great. The more I can talk about it, the better.
Good on you. Bill Shorten, NDIS Minister, joining us there. He's got to get to question time now. He's got about 8 minutes to do so. We're going to continue our coverage through until 2 o'clock when question time begins, and we'll bring our National Affairs Editor, Melissa Clark, back in with us. I don't know if we want to pick up on NDIS, Mel. If you do, otherwise I've got questions on Future Made in Australia.
Oh, look, there's a lot to cover, clearly. Whenever you have a budget, there's a lot of elements